Hello, and welcome to the Australian 2020 edition of Paraguay Speaks Day 4. My name is Mercedes Huidobro, and I'm the Secretary of the Paraguayan Student Association. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands from where we are all gathered today and pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. The webinar is live now on the PSA Facebook, and it is being recorded for our YouTube channel. I would like to remind you that this webinar will consist of a presentation given by the speaker and then a 20 minutes time allocated to answer your questions. If you are watching us through Facebook, you can leave your questions in the comment section. You can also leave your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. Join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #ParaguaySpeaks2020. Now I will introduce the host and interviewer of the night, Mr. Adrian Hearn, Professor of Latin American Studies at the University of Melbourne. In his research career, he explores the cultural challenges and opportunities arising from international relations with questions such as what can Chinese, Latin American, and Australian cities teach each other about sustainable food production and consumption? How are growing Chinese migrant communities contributing to Latin American economic development and globalization? He has published 6 books on Latin America and China and an interactive 360-degree film on indigenous ecological knowledge titled Who is Nature? He holds a doctorate of anthropology from La Trobe University and a bachelor's of arts in anthropology from the University of Wisconsin. So welcome, Professor Adrian.
Thank you, Mercedes, and hello, everybody. This is, well, a great pleasure to be back with Paraguay Speaks. I was with the event last year in a somewhat different format, and well, we just have to kind of make do, don't we, with this new situation that we're in. It's not really my job to say much except to introduce Mr. Nickson and perhaps shoot some questions at him afterwards. I'll also be interested to see if anyone who's watching writes some questions into the Q&A box, which you'll be able to do. And then I'll be able to read some of those questions out at the end and put them to Andrew. I should, before I say anything else, just reiterate something that Mercedes also mentioned, and that is in Australia, similar to Paraguay, we have to recognize that we are working on lands that have been inhabited for a very long time, thousands of years. And in the case of where I stand at the moment in Brunswick in Melbourne, close to the University of Melbourne, this is Wurundjeri territory. Wurundjeri is one of the 5 clans of the Kulin Nation. And this is a history which I think we all need to do something to become a little bit more aware of. And, you know, my experience with indigenous issues here is they're very much tied to ecological and environmental concerns. So in that sense, this is a good fit this evening. We're going to be speaking about environmental issues and how to balance sustainability with the environment in Paraguay. Fascinating topic and you know, a really important one. We're lucky to have Mr. Andrew Nickson with us. I'll just say something about Mr. Nickson. He studied economics at the University of Cambridge and is currently honorary reader at the University of Birmingham in England. So among his interests are local government, decentralization, urban water policy, and political economy, and all of that infused with a sense for environmental futures. He leads an in-country and online training program for the United Nations System Staff College, and for many years has been working in Paraguay. He writes regularly on Paraguay as well for the Economist Intelligence Unit and for Oxford Analytica and IHS Janus. He's co-author of the Paraguay Reader with Duke University Press and author of the Historical Dictionary of Paraguay. He's also written a number of very interesting articles, including El lento proceso de la descentralización en Paraguay, el papel del clientelismo, right? And so this is a critical issue for what we'll be discussing this evening. How can governance decisions be appropriately decentralized without clientelism and hopefully without corruption? Another article that I'll mention of Andrew's is a study of Paraguay's Tecoporá conditional cash transfer program, which he completed for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. I could go on. There are many other things that Andrew has written, but I think it's best if we let him speak for himself. I'll just say that Andrew will be speaking with us about meeting that challenge of making the economy sustainable for the future. That is, building environmental issues into economic growth, right? So to try and balance the two. And I think Andrew will be arguing, he's just told me beforehand, that to achieve that balance will be critical for the future of Paraguay. So it really is critical. It's an important challenge. So I would normally invite you all to sort of welcome Andrew with me, but Andrew will just have to imagine the applause around the world at the moment. And on that point then, I'll pass over to Andrew. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian, for your kind introduction. And good evening to all of you in Australia. And good morning to those of you who are attending the Zoom from Paraguay. Here where I am in Birmingham, England, it's lunchtime. So we are spanning the day in this presentation. I'm now going to begin my presentation. And so if you'll give me a few seconds while I put it up on the screen. And here we are. Right. Okay. So the title of my presentation is The Challenge of Inclusive and Sustainable Development in Paraguay. And what I want to do today is to analyze a core argument, which is the following: that the current economic growth model in Paraguay is not conducive to sustainable and inclusive development. That is my core argument. So I'm going to try and demonstrate why I think this argument is correct. Let's start by looking at the favorable macroeconomic picture. It is true that in Paraguay, since about 2005 onwards, the economy has started to grow faster. The growth rate on average has doubled from around 2 to 3% to 5%. Of course, on the present situation with COVID, there has been a decline in the growth rate, but much less perhaps than many other countries in the region of Latin America. The GDP per head is now around $4,000, bringing Paraguay into the lower middle income ranking on the world arena. The rate of inflation is low. The fiscal deficit is low. It's risen to around 30% of GDP. The fiscal deficit risen to over 4% of GDP at the moment. Because of the large scale of the unofficial part of the economy, which as a result of under-invoicing of exports and so on. Paraguay has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Sustain Are you hearing me okay?
Mr. Andrew, I think the connection is having a problem, so we lost the last part.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I will. The last part being the last slide I just showed. Yeah.
Is everything okay? Hello?
This
Hi.
one on the challenge of
It might be an idea for Andrew to turn off his video of himself as well. That might help.
turn off the video of
Mr. I think you would have to share screen again.
hear me? Okay, I'll be connected.
Could you repeat that, please?
Well, I think that in the meantime, maybe Adrian, I don't know if you would like to share with us the movie that you launched with the University of Melbourne.
Mercedes, sure, I'm happy to do that. I guess in some ways it relates to what Andrew is talking about. I'm conscious that this is Andrew's event and not mine, so I don't want to say too much. But I can certainly say a few things about the film. What we've developed is a film about environment and indigenous issues in Latin America. And largely, we're looking at, perspectives on natural medicine and perspectives on protecting lakes and protecting, enclaves that have traditional significance for many communities in the region. We've also tried to compare some of those perspectives and values with those of indigenous communities here in Australia. So I'm happy to maybe pass on the link to that, but people could find it anyway. If people are interested in seeing it, you could type in "Who is Nature?" with a question mark. Who is Nature? That's the name of the film. And the reason it's called that is that as I went around asking people about their perspectives on nature, of course, there were very many different perspectives because people live in different cultures and contexts, but everybody had one thing in common, and that was that their answers spoke about nature not as a thing, but as a living entity. And I found that fascinating. So we made this 360-degree film to understand what they meant by that. So if you type in "Who is Nature" and just search for it, you should see that come up with the University of Melbourne. I think next week we're releasing a lower resolution version for smartphones. So you could check back and it's very then easy to look at on a phone. Andrew, are you back with us? I see you.
I am. I'm listening to you. Yes.
Okay, sorry, I don't mean to take over. This is your talk. Let me stop right there, and we'll get back to you, Andrew.
Okay, so I'll go back into screen share and let's hope that the connection doesn't drop. Okay.
Great.
Right. You're muted by the host. It says I'm muted. I'm unmuted now. Okay, good. Right, so I was asking what is the problem? We got faster growth, macroeconomic stability. So we need to unpack what we mean by inclusive and sustainable development. And when we do this, we find that the human development profile of the country is still very weak. High levels of extreme poverty and general poverty index is quite high. These are official figures from the Dirección General de Estadística y Censo. Poverty levels have fallen, but they're still not acceptable. The educational quality level recently was ranked by the World Economic Forum as the worst out of 140 countries. This is a very worrying statistics. The number of contact hours per year is one of the lowest in the world, but the quality of education is also extremely low. The low health profile has been laid bare by the COVID pandemic, and there is a large housing deficit, especially in the areas around Asunción and Ciudad del Este for low-income families. And perhaps most worrying of all is the low level of social protection. Protection in the form of being members of the Instituto de Previsión Social or of a pension fund. Only 20% of workers are covered by one or the other. So a key question is, how do we explain this apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, a high level of economic growth and a persistently low level of human development? And that contradiction is not something, unfortunately, that is disappearing. In some ways, it is becoming more apparent than before. So we have the irony that Paraguay is the fourth largest exporter of soybean in the world, and yet, according to UNICEF, the United Nations body that cares for the well-being of children and infants, still has a very high level of infant malnutrition. So I am fortunately privileged to have been associated with Paraguay now for around 5 decades. And I think we need to look at this growth trajectory that I mentioned that took off from the mid-1990s in a kind of historical sense, and to examine the underlying trends in order to capture the direction of travel of the current growth model. So what is this growth model? Well, basically, it's simply the insertion of the Paraguayan economy into the world market by exporting a range of low value-added agricultural commodities. And this has taken off since the 1990s. Soybean, the 10th largest, organic sugar, the top world exporter, stevia, café, the second largest in the world, and rice, a share which is still small, but which is growing fast. So what am I worried about? Why is this model, why am I saying this model is unsustainable? On the face of it, and many people in Paraguay genuinely believe that there is no problem. I do believe, however, that the model itself is unsustainable. And in order to examine that, we have to look at three aspects which are embedded deeply in the SDGs for 2030. Three aspects of sustainability: environmental, inclusivity, and personal security. Let's look at environmental sustainability first. And here the most worrying sign is the massive rate of deforestation. In 2018, the rate of deforestation in the Chaco, in the western region, which is 2/3 of the country, of the territory, was 0.4 hectares, not per day, not per hour, but per minute. In the east of the country, 1/3 of the territory, there has been in operation a zero deforestation law, but it has failed. It is not implemented. There is still massive deforestation taking place, particularly around the Brazilian border. But the environmental sustainability problem goes deeper than that. And I think the core of the problem is the monoculture which we see now in the country. I've referred to the other range of cereals, but the most important one in terms of occupying land is soybean. Soybean now occupies nearly 1/4 of the total land area of Eastern Paraguay. And that's including areas covered by urban settlements, areas that are occupied by the lakes, lagunas. 23% is the official figure, and that's rising. The latest soybean harvest in this last year was a new record, over 10 million tons, and that rate is increasing. So what you see now in large parts of Eastern Paraguay, the departments of Alto Paraná, Canindeyú, Amambay, is what I've called the 3 S's: the Scania, the silos, and the soca, and very little S, very little. It is a very sad rural scene that one sees in this part of the country. The threat to the Chaco is particularly worrying. Half of the cattle herd of the country is now located there, and there are even plans to introduce drought-resistant soybean varieties in the far north of the Chaco, near the Brazilian and the Bolivian border, which are currently in an experimental stage. Part of the consequence of the rapid deforestation is the greater incidence of extreme flooding that we now find amongst the lower reaches of the Paraguay River. Asunción and Villeta, near the Argentinian frontier, have been affected by extreme flooding. In 2019, 70,000 citizens were evacuated from areas around Asunción. And then there is the link to the increase in dengue fever. There's a lot of evidence now coming from entomologists, that environmental scientists, that the incidence of dengue, the last epidemic which we found in Paraguay in the first half of this year, was the largest ever recorded, is in some ways linked to deforestation through climate change. Okay, so I want to move on now to talk about inclusivity and the question of social exclusion. And here's a quote from the planning minister of Paraguay in 2016, a man called Jose Molinas. And he says that it's unacceptable that our country produces food for 60 million people when we've got, in our own country, 500,000 people suffering from hunger in rural areas. And we need to address these questions of social exclusion in the country. But what is the underlying cause of this social exclusion? Well, I would argue that it is the extractive agricultural model that I just described very briefly, which is the underlying cause. It is a highly capital intensive model. It is more capital intensive form of agriculture than what we have in this country, in the United Kingdom, in which a tractor, one man, usually a man on the tractor, can easily till and harvest no less than 200 to 300 hectares of land. It does not require very many workers. And it is expelling small farmers as this model increases, expelling small farmers and their families to urban areas and increasingly abroad in search of work. And I find it very interesting in the part of Paraguay that I know best, in the regions, the rural regions that I know best, that despite this high rate of growth, the boom in agricultural production, the rate of emigration of young males and females with low educational qualifications to Argentina has not slowed down. And this, I think, is dramatic proof that this is a model which is not creating unemployment. In spite of the situation in Argentina, which, as we know, is very volatile economically, emigration to that country continues as before, despite the faster economic growth of the economy. So we have the paradox of high urban growth and increasing unemployment in urban areas and underemployment in the large cities, and this flow of emigration to neighboring countries, and increasingly, until recently at least, particularly to Spain, in Europe, to Spain and Italy. And yet the public narrative for this model, which is one that is broadly supported by the political leaders of the country, is that it is a model that creates employment and that increases living standards. And yet, I have to say, the evidence does not support this argument. So, the impact of this exclusionary growth model has a limited effect, what economists call a trickle-down effect, in raising living standards and creating employment. Linkages with other sectors are limited because most of these crops are exported in an unprocessed manner. There is some processing of soybean, so linkages with other sectors of the economy are quite limited. And the rapid advance of the soybean frontier as the volume of production increases, as soybean moves more and more westward, is strangling small farmer communities and encouraging this internal and external migration. So what we find then is the lack of industrial growth in the urban areas means that the migrants are not absorbed by industry. They're absorbed by working in the low income informal sector, working basically on the streets, trying to earn a living for their family, selling products and doing odd jobs in and around the large city of Asuncion. Okay, so the informal sector, this is where people end up. This is the other side of the coin of this growth model. The official definition in Paraguay is people that are in the informal sector, if they're earning less than the minimum salary, which is around 2 million Guaranis, 2.2 million Guaranis per month, sorry, or they're not enrolled in the state social security system, IPS. At the moment, 65, these are official figures. All of the figures that I'm presenting today are official figures, I think, without exception. 65% of the labor force are employed in the informal sector, which, by the way, is one reason why the COVID pandemic is potentially having such a dangerous impact on Paraguay. The construction sector, 88% of people working there are in the informal sector with no job security. Commerce, restaurants and hotels, 70%. Manufacturing, 62%. Many of these people are earning far less than the minimum salary in the country. And this I am proposing is a consequence of the current economic growth model, which is so highly dependent on the export of unprocessed primary products. Okay, so this is just some statistics on the growth in the level of unemployment, and what it's showing, it's from 2016, but it could have been from more recently, is that despite high growth rate, the rate of unemployment and underemployment is still rising. Again, there is no clear linkage between fast economic growth and levels of unemployment and underemployment, because it is a model that is not absorbing labor to a considerable extent. I want to move on to the third aspect of sustainability. I've talked about environmental sustainability, inclusivity. The third element is the question of personal security, which you may be surprised to know is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the 17 goals talks quite understandably about personal security. What we find now in Paraguay, as unfortunately in many countries in Latin America, has been a growth in common crime, especially in urban areas, a surge in narcotics-related crime, especially in rural areas, and the emergence of a small political insurgency in the departments of San Pedro and Concepcion. Let's look at narcotics-related crime first of all. And here we find that Paraguay is now a major exporter of marijuana, domestically produced, and also a transit route for cocaine coming from the Andes on through Brazil to the world market. The murder rate closely associated with narcotics crime is in the department of Amambay amongst the highest in the Americas at a micro level. It's extremely high. Narcotics criminality is no longer just confined to Amambay, but has spread to most regions in the country. Although the death rate, the murder rate, fortunately has not also spread to the same extent. But narcotics criminality is no longer just confined to the northeast of the country. And now it is becoming present in the political system itself. And there is a danger of a rerun of the tragic history of Central America in that respect. In Paraguay's very overcrowded prisons, there are now at least, and these are official figures from the head of the prison service, over 700 prison inmates are members of the Primer Comando do Capital, the largest narcotics criminal organization in Brazil. Again, the danger of a rerun of Central America, as more and more Paraguayan prisoners, inmates, affiliate themselves with the PCC. And finally, political insurgency. The Ejército del Pueblo Paraguayo and two other small groups operate in San Pedro and Concepcion on a relatively small scale, but are growing slowly in numbers. Structural factors of the model, of the economic model, are important in understanding this insurgency. And I've written a paper on this if anyone is interested. The westward expansion of the soybean frontiera has come up against traditional small farmer colonization communities, the so-called Eje Norte in San Pedro and Concepcion, where it's met with much stronger resistance from deeply embedded small farmer communities. And that is a structural factor, that conflict, that choque, as it's called, is a factor in explaining the emergence of, explaining why the insurgency appeared there in that part of the country. So this brings me, I painted a rather depressing scenario, some of you may feel, but this brings me on to the crucial role of the state in the development process. Certainly, the Paraguayan political and economic leadership have been very attracted to the virtues of neoliberalism and the virtues of the free market over the past few decades, but globally, the attraction of both is somewhat on the wane since the arrival of COVID pandemic, which has been a wake-up call, making political leaders around the world realize the importance of the state in defending the interests of the broad majority of the population from epidemics of this kind. And I think it's led to a new interest and recognition of the importance of public policies for human welfare. Even in Paraguay, there is no way that the private sector alone, that the free market could have dealt with COVID. And so we see a new importance attached to the role of the state in the development process, which I personally think is a very positive move. 3 examples here of where the state intervention is necessary: the emergence of very low quality garage universities in Paraguay, totally unregulated, giving extremely low quality tertiary education; the epidemic of motorcycle accidents, which is now absorbing a very high proportion of the budget of the Ministry of Health's Emergency and Accident Service, simply because there is no enforcement of the current regulations that people should wear helmets, cascos on the roads, and the deforestation of the Chaco, which is currently not being addressed by the Paraguayan state. So what's the way forward? What's the way forward for dealing with this problem, this structural problem? Well, I think the Paraguayan state must stop being on autopilot, with its aim just limited to maintaining the growth rate, all the obsession with the growth rate, low inflation, and the money supply. A very, very limited, a very blinkered view of macroeconomic management, which many countries around the world see as insufficient in terms of addressing the global concerns of sustainability. They are important. No one can deny the importance of these issues, but they are insufficient. The role of the state must go far beyond this. And here I'm not talking about state ownership of everything. I'm not talking about command economy. I'm talking about the state intervening in a manner to protect the well-being of its citizens, a more proactive stance in addressing issues of sustainability. Not rocket science, as I say here, just requires the political will to do so. So let's look at 3 areas in which a more sustainable, inclusive development style could be achieved. And here I think the fundamental challenge is to rebalance this very lopsided, this very biased development strategy and reduce the overdependence on the export of primary products. And to do this, I think there are 3 key areas for strengthening the contribution of the growth rate to human development. Now look at them each in turn: industrialization, agricultural diversification, and high quality education. First of all, industrialization. Even the International Monetary Fund, I'm sorry for the mistake in this date, it should say April 2019, not 2029. The IMF in a recent policy document said that Paraguay should reduce the dependence on the agricultural sector because that's important in diversifying the economy. What they're really saying here in the coded language of the IMF is a greater impulse to industrialization. The industrial sector has remained stagnant at 15% of GDP now for over 2 decades. Its share of the economy is not growing. And yet we have this paradox that Paraguay is endowed with renewable hydroenergy on an enormous scale, which is currently sold at very low prices to Brazil and Argentina. More about that later. And it lends itself to the development of an energy-intensive industrialization strategy, which would transform the skill levels of the labor force. And here, I do believe that a priority action which a government in Paraguay should seriously consider is the electrification of the railway between Asunción and Encarnación. This is undoubtedly what economists call low-hanging fruit, which is still to be picked, basically in Paraguay because of the enormous political power of the road transport lobby. Renegotiation of the Itaipu Treaty in 2023 is a crucially important upcoming public policy issue, which the government, or the current government and the incoming government that takes office in 2023 will need to address. And here, two crucial demands are important. The freedom to sell electricity to third-party countries. At the moment, all of the Paraguayan excess energy of its half share from Itaipu has to be sold to Brazil, can't be sold to third-party countries. And those sales that continue to Brazil should be based not on the idea of compensation, but on a price that reflects the regional market price for electricity in the Southern Cone. But such measures must be accompanied by a process of industrialization. And at the moment, I see little evidence of a discussion of this aspect of public policy in the renegotiation of the Itaipu Treaty. Secondly, diversification of the agricultural sector to offset the overdependence on soybean, to rebalance. Not to close down soybean, of course, but to rebalance, to give greater importance to a more inclusive style of development that creates greater jobs in a sustainable manner. And here the experience of the Frutica company in the Colonia Cresburgo in Itaipu is very interesting, because they have outsourced the production of fruits, orange and other fruits, which are processed and manufactured in the company, by involving large numbers of small farmers in the surrounding area of that part of the country. And here a priority action has to be the total reform of one of the most inefficient ministries in the Paraguayan public sector, the Ministry of Agriculture and Ganaderia and cattle ranching, to give a strong impulse to technical assistance to farmers, improve credit and the CAH and the Extension Service DEAG. This has
Andrew,
again been long discussed. But
Andrew,
yes,
we miss you. We miss you the last bit, and I think it was very interesting.
Which slide did you miss? This one or the previous one?
It was the previous one.
Okay, I'll go back to the previous one. Was it this one on Itaipu? Was it this one?
The first part of the next slide.
The first part of the next slide. Yes, I was saying that diversification of the agricultural sector should be in the direction of rebalancing to reduce the overdependence on one commodity, soybean, to diversify away from monocultivo, towards a more inclusive agricultural development. And here I gave the example of the Frutica company in Colonia Cresburgo, which outsources the production of fruits, particularly oranges, to several thousand small farmers who provide the inputs into the processing of fruits for fruit drinks, which are produced domestically manufactured and increasingly exported. Did you hear me there? Is that okay? Are we back on stream?
Yes, we are back on stream.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll carry on. And the priority action here has to be to completely reform the Ministry of Agriculture, which is a myriad of overlapping departments with little coordination between them, deeply infected by clientelism, and as a result, its support that it gives to small farmers is very, and has been for decades, very inadequate. So it needs a total reform, and that would be a signal. That would be very clear evidence of a proactive move by the state in Paraguay. The FAO has been calling for this literally for 3 decades, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and little has been done to move in this direction. And that's why small farmers are very much regarded, very much neglected in terms of public policy towards the agricultural sector. The focus is very much on commercial agriculture and commercial cattle ranching. And thirdly, high quality public education. At the moment, the debate on education is unfortunately limited to physical infrastructure, roofs that fall down, walls that are not in good quality, and the percentage of the budget which goes to education. These are, of course, important issues. I'm not denying that. But more important than that is what happens in the classroom. Many parts of the country now have good schools, good in the sense that the physical infrastructure is of good quality, and yet what happens in the classroom is still very, very inadequate. The lack of preparation of classes by teachers, the rote learning that still goes on, the extremely low contact hours, and the fact that there's virtually no evaluation of teacher performance. So an overall of the structure of pedagogic and administrative supervision by the Education Ministry, which are again dominated by clientelistic systems, the regional Director de Supervisión Académica, Pedagógica, Supervisión Administrativa, needs a complete overhaul, as do the teacher training centers where the teachers are, the future teachers are trained, the institutos de formación, many of whom are led by not by professionals, but by political operatives. So again, this is not rocket science. It just requires a proactive stance by a government which is prepared to make structural reforms to the education system. This, just as a matter of interest to many of you listening, because I understand many of you are Becal students, this is the response when I asked students at Guayabi, San Pedro branch of the Universidad Nacional de Caguazú, when I gave a lecture there about 2 years ago. At the end of my presentation, I asked them to levantar la mano si han escuchado una vez de Becal. And as you can see, the vast majority of the students there in rural areas, this is a state university, but very poor facilities, had never heard of Becal. So challenging this unsustainable model, going back to the 3 core aspects that I introduced right at the beginning, the 3 aspects of sustainability, environmental, inclusiveness, and personal security. Let's very quickly summarize what I propose could be a sign, a pointer of genuine commitment to the SDGs. A ban on deforestation of the Chaco, a ban on the use of dangerous pesticides, heavy fines and imprisonment for those who break the zero deforestation law in Eastern Paraguay. Move towards Paraguay becoming the Costa Rica of Southern Cone. Costa Rica is a very interesting country. It's a small country like Paraguay, which has marketed it in a genuine sense as an environmentally sustainable country, attracting environmental tourism, exporting environmentally guaranteed products onto the world market. There's little reason why Paraguay could not move in this direction as well, but it requires the political will to do so. And of course, greatly strengthen the very, very poorly funded environmental ministry, which is only relatively recently created. I think it's only 3 or 4 years that it exists, MADES, and the recruitment of qualified professionals to work within that ministry. And here I want to make a quick reference to an Instagram post of a few days ago by Leonardo DiCaprio about the Cerro Lagoon in Limpio, which where there's been a case of extreme contamination by chromium from a leather processing factory on the banks of the lagoon. And Leonardo DiCaprio made a post about this. And what was interesting was that the environmental ministry that I just referred to, MADES, had known about this contamination for at least 6 months, but had done nothing to intervene. And yet 2 days later, this is a title from a newspaper, ABC, I think, or Última Hora, Paraguay suspende industria tras denuncia de acto DiCaprio. So this is a shot of the lagoon, and it is a very revealing, but in some ways a rather depressing little incident, because it suggests that public policy reform, proactive stance by the state, requires pressure from outside rather than taking these decisions on its own initiative. Secondly, inclusive development. Again, going back to the IMF statement from 2017, although there have been statements exactly the same last year, tax reform that rebalances away from indirect taxation, that's VAT and import duties, and that maintains low income tax rates, but limits deductions, could improve progressivity. They're calling for tax reform. At the moment, the level of deductions from personal income tax liability are extremely high. And that means that in practice, around 50% of people who are liable for income tax do not pay any income tax whatsoever. Also, the large grain exporting companies engage in tax transfer pricing to make profits appear outside the country and reduce the tax takes in Paraguay. And inclusive development also requires strengthening the existing conditional cash transfer programs like Tecoporá, Tenonderá, and Tecoja that are carried out by the Social Development Ministry. And finally, on citizen security, the state will have to regain national sovereignty over Amambay, where in practice it no longer controls large parts of the territory. There is a law that was passed in 2005 banning the sale of land to foreigners within 50 kilometers of the national frontier. Brazil has a similar law on its side of the border, which is implemented, but this law is simply not implemented 15 years later. And the illegal arms trade around Ciudad del Este has to be cleaned up. It's not very well known in Paraguay that the United States of America, the US government, banned the export of some small arms to Paraguay in 2017 because of repeated revelations that these arms were in fact being ferried through to narcotics gangs in Brazil. And finally, on citizen security, to replace the counterproductive military strategy led by CODI and the Fuerza de Tarea Conjunta in the heartland of the insurgency with a non-military strategy of support for programs for small farmers would do far more to reduce the temptation to engage in violent action against the Paraguayan state. So, what does this all add up to? It requires a public policy reform process. The state simply abandoning this approach of being on autopilot and taking a more proactive stance in the direction of a more inclusive and sustainable development model. A reform of public policy making, which is not just about technical decisions. This is a highly political process. We now know academics are studying this with great interest around the world. The way reform processes take place require a mix of technical and political support in order to be successful. And that requires at the political level a move towards a programmatic political culture. At the moment, politics in Paraguay is what political scientists call non-programmatic. The two main parties, the Colorado and the Liberal Party, do not compete on the basis of alternative programs. Certainly they make promises from time to time, but it's more about traditional affiliations and allegiance to caudillos and political operators that bring in the vote at election time on the basis of clientelistic mechanism. So drawing my presentation to a close now, we have to be realistic about the challenges of moving towards a more sustainable development model. There will be resistance to reforms. The current 5% of the population who dominate the economic and political elite are by far the main beneficiaries of this current model, as reflected in the growing inequality in income and wealth, which is recorded by the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and other global bodies. So the implementation of policy reforms will face resistance from very powerful vested interests, the Asociación Paraguaya de Sojeros and the Asociación Rural de Paraguay. Interestingly, the Asociación Rural de Paraguay, if you look at its logo, it's very interesting to see El porvenir de la patria está en el campo. Well, one might say cynically, well, that says it all. The ARP does not see the future of the country as in any process of industrialization, despite the enormous per capita hydro energy endowment that Paraguay has, the second largest in the world after the little Asian country in the Himalayas, Nepal. It sees the future very much as being in el campo. There will therefore be elite opposition to any serious reform agenda. Opposition to fiscal reform, as I've said, opposition to a proper, a serious personal income tax, agrarian reform, opposition to redistribution of the scandal of the tierras malavidas. These are state lands that were parceled out to friends and family by the Stroessner regime, and for some years after that, at peppercorn prices, when those donations virtually were completely against the government's own agrarian reform legislation, which said that the land should go to small farmers. And for decades since, small farmers have been fighting, frankly, with little success through the legal system to get these lands confiscated and redistributed in a more egalitarian manner. Civil service reform, opposition to a merit-based system of staff selection, which would put an end to clientelism. Again, there are good legislation. There's good civil service legislation on the statute books. It's simply not implemented with regard to methods of selection and promotion systems. And finally, education reform. And here one could argue that there is little interest in the elite in moving towards a high quality education system, because that would simply question the availability of cheap labor, from which it benefits enormously inside the country at all levels. So, by way of conclusion, historical legacies do not determine our future. They mold it, they influence it, but there are examples of many countries where countries can move on to a different growth or development trajectory and break away, as it were, from the path dependence that Professor North talked about so many years ago. So what will happen if the Paraguayan state continues on its current track, limiting its role to macroeconomic stability and leaving the current growth model on autopilot? Because there is a real danger, possibility that this will happen. Well, and here my final conclusion, as someone who has monitored fairly closely the changes in Paraguay over 5 decades, I do believe that there is a real danger, and I've written about this recently, there's a real danger that Paraguay will continue its slow and imperceptible slide, despite high growth, in the direction of a failed state. And associated with that, because of the complex relationship with Brazil, is a real threat to national sovereignty. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Andrew, for this presentation. And now I will pass to Adrian so we can begin with the debate.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, hopefully my video is working. Andrew, thank you so much for these comments. I mean, you've given us a lot to consider. That's, you know, quite a sobering look, I think, at some of the issues that Paraguay faces. Now, I mean, my impression listening to your presentation is that, you know, we could take many of these issues and kind of go zoom in on them and look locally at their impact. We could also zoom out. And I think if we zoomed out, we might see that these issues that you're talking about are also becoming a real challenge for other countries as well. In particular in South America, where the agricultural sector has risen to be the #1 export sector. So even overtaking mining in value. And you know, we could go even beyond Latin America and look at other commodity producers, including Australia, right? And in fact, I would encourage those of us who are in Australia at the moment, and perhaps those of you from Paraguay who are either here in Australia or interested in Australia, you might think of comparing some of these issues that Andrew has mentioned in Paraguay with some of the issues that Australia faces. So how is Australia dealing with the growing profile of the agriculture export sector? I mean, it's become quite well known now that the expansion of wheat and barley exports is clearly encroaching on small farmers and people that are producing food for Australian cities. So the city of Melbourne, for example, and Sydney have a certain capacity to produce their own food, but that capacity is reducing as the export commodities take over. Now, how is it then that Paraguay and Australia could face this similar challenge? Well, think about it, because the demand for commodities is growing, and it's coming largely from Asia and particularly from China as the urbanization process unfolds in China. So you might ask then, well, why is Australia pursuing that path? Why does Paraguay pursue that path? Well, of course, the easy answer is economic growth, short-term economic growth. Right now, is that sustainable in the long term? Australia is often talked of as the lucky country because of its natural resources. And at least for 40 or 50 years now, you know, that has been a theme. Now, will it continue to be a theme for 40 or 50 years more? Perhaps it will. But if people start having to buy their lettuces and fruits and vegetables from, you know, far away from other states or other countries, then we have to start asking ourselves, is this really a lucky situation? And I think the issues in Paraguay that Andrew is mentioning, mentioned the case of Concepcion, for example, where small farmers have been pushing back against big agribusiness, soybean production, is something that we can compare. So I guess I would just encourage those of us who are interested both in Paraguay and in Australia, since this is Paraguay Speaks from Australia this evening, to think about that as a theme, to take some of Andrew's thoughts and consider how they might be relevant to both of these contexts, and how they might really form the basis of some interesting studies that those of us who work in universities or are studying could look at. These would be really mutually beneficial concepts and challenges to compare between Australia and Paraguay. Now, I think I've probably said enough. There are a lot of questions that have come through over the hour that Andrew's been talking. So I want to raise some of those questions and put them to you, Andrew. I've been keeping track of them here in the Q&A tab, and I can see more and more of them coming through. So I'll start with a couple that I picked out earlier on. I'm going to do them in order, right? So, well, you can keep them coming in if you want to, but let's see how far we get. I think we have perhaps about 20 minutes left. Is that right, Mercedes, Alejandra, something like that? About 20 minutes? Yeah, thumbs up
Yes,
from
yes,
Alejandra?
for
Okay.
sure.
Okay, excellent. So let me put this one to you. This is the first one that came in, Andrew. And this is from Dr. Tariq Zepkan. And Dr. Zepkan asks this. And Tariq, forgive me, but I've paraphrased your question because I wanted to make it just a little shorter. But let me know in the Q&A if I did it badly. So my take on Tariq's question is this. Obviously, deforestation is terrible. However, could Paraguay have achieved such economic success since the 1990s without deforestation? How have other nations, such as Brazil, managed this? And can Paraguay learn something from these larger nations on the balance between agriculture and foresting and keeping the forests alive? It's a very relevant question. And Andrew, I'd love to hear what you think about, because it's true, isn't it, that economic growth is something that we can take for granted, but we do need it. So isn't this a sort of, an impossible trap to escape from? What do you think?
Thank you. Well, thank you, Tariq, for your question. It's a very interesting one. I think in a way this addresses the core of my argument as to what we mean by economic success. It is true that as a result of deforestation in the eastern region of Paraguay, the growth of soybean production has been faster, but it has led, as I said, to faster economic growth through the export of largely unprocessed soybean. But economic success, we need to unpack it. Whose economic success has that brought about? Has it led to the economic success of the average small farmer in those regions which have been deforested? No, I really don't think they have. They have not benefited. The commercial agricultural sector operates in almost complete separation from the smallholder subsector of agriculture. And if there is any linkage, it's because the small sector is simply being pushed out and surrounded by large holdings. What I do believe is that if we think of economic success more in terms of inclusivity, and if we define economic success in a different way, then a model which gave greater importance to small farmer production, particularly for the domestic market, but also as I gave in the case of Frutica, producing goods also for the export market, could have had a much greater impact on overall well-being of the population, particularly of the bottom 2 quintiles of the population, the poorest 40%, who have been the major groups in society who have benefited least. Not just benefited least, they have suffered, I would say, from the dramatic growth in soybean production. As I said in my presentation, I'm not at all advocating the complete ending of the soybean model, but it needs a rebalancing. So I'm not avoiding your question, but I'm trying to unpack that very phrase you'll use, economic success, what we mean by economic success. And I think we live in a world now which is beginning to really question and try to interrogate that definition of what we actually mean by economic success. I do believe that a more balanced agricultural development strategy could lead to a much greater economic success for broad sectors of the population. Can't hear you.
Sorry, yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Andrew. We're going to move on to a related question because, and this is from Enrique Fleitas. I'll read your question, Enrique, and then just say something about it. So Enrique asks, what do you think about the political sector in Paraguay? Many people believe that this actual model, it's the biggest problem in the sustainable growth of Paraguay. So, Andrew, you mentioned politics, and perhaps you've already answered Enrique's question, but do you think that that's the case, that the biggest problem here is the political sector?
Okay, very interesting question. I try to keep out of politics because in Paraguay Speaks, I don't want to get into a political discussion very much. But I actually believe the judicial system is in terms of deep structural problems. The educational system, the judicial system, and yes, the political system are major challenges to moving in the direction of sustainable development. I did touch on this briefly when I said that the problem with the political culture in Paraguay at the moment is that it is what as political scientists called a non-programmatic political culture. Elections, election meetings, election discussions are not about comparing in any analytical way the merits or otherwise of the various parties' political programs. In fact, there's very little difference. If one talked about a program, very little difference between the two parties. Two parties are wedded to the current model of growth, macroeconomic stability, boosting exports, period. That's it. That's what we're trying to do. And the rest is just icing on the cake. Yes, Enrique, you're right that the political system does pose enormous challenges in moving towards sustainable development, and it does require the gradual introduction of what we call programmatic politics, so that these kinds of policy options that we're talking about, policy reforms, can be debated and discussed in a serious manner and can influence public policy reforms. It's very easy for me to say that from outside, but I do recognize, and I think that's probably behind Enrique's question, that is an enormous challenge, because the leadership of political parties in Paraguay are still, in that sense, very traditional, if that's the right word.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll move straight on to the next question. This is from Shane Blakely. Thanks, Shane, for this. And I'll just read directly what Shane says. He says, in light of your pessimistic assessment of the current political will to elevate the poor, would you not be better off advocating for increased involvement of Western corporate farmers with modern ESG policies?
Well, thank you for your question, Shane. If I understood it, you seem to be suggesting that, given the unwillingness or the incapacity of successive governments in the country to, as you put it, elevate the poor, that role could be carried out by ESG companies coming from outside the country. Well, I have to say, however well-meaning that approach might seem, I think it probably would fail in Paraguay. Paraguay is, for historical reasons, quite understandably, a country that's been in 2 of the 3 major wars, international wars in the region, is a deeply nationalistic country. And even now, people are perhaps understandably skeptical, suspicious of the motives of bodies coming from outside the country. They can perhaps make a contribution, but I think it would be in some ways an affront to national sovereignty to suggest that private companies from abroad could, in a way, solve these deep structural problems of Paraguay. I think there will be severe limitations in terms of the ability of moves in this direction having any real impact, because ultimately these changes are the preserve of the state in any country. We're talking about public policies. We can't get away from that.
Thanks for that, Andrew. There's an interesting question here next in line from an anonymous viewer. And I think it's an interesting question because it gets at the, the prospect that deforestation may have a kind of endpoint once the land has been converted. In other words, once a cattle ranch gets put in place, then the deforestation then reaches the limit, at least around that particular ranch. Let me read the question. Don't you think the deforestation rate of the Chaco right now is high due to the development of the region? It will eventually decrease when cattle ranches are fully developed, respecting environmental laws. Even though some people do not respect the laws, there is a large number that does respect them. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, dear Mr. or Mrs. or Miss Anon, I would beg to differ with you. That I don't believe that it's true that the vast majority of cattle ranchers respect the current legislation, which requires cattle ranchers to retain 25% of any land which has been granted eligibility for deforestation, and I think the proof of that is the data that has been published in the past by Paraguay, the main NGO working in this field, from satellite imagery. The rate of deforestation is so vast that it belies the suggestion that cattle ranchers are keeping to these rules. And of course, a lot of the deforestation is carried out completely illegally. It's by companies that have not even been granted permission by the environmental agency to deforest a certain amount of their land. What I'm saying is that at the moment it's a free-for-all. It's taking place in a manner which is almost completely, in practice, unregulated, and so the kind of scenario that you're suggesting is just not in accordance with what's happening in the Chaco.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Another question here from Carlos Antonio, and I suspect you might agree with this, but let's see. Carlos writes, I have a tendency to describe Paraguayan economy basically as un oligopolio extractivo. Would you argue that this view is correct, or do you think this is an exaggeratedly alarmist view? What do you think, Andrew?
Okay. I think there's I would agree with that to some extent. That is true. More in the cattle ranching sector. I recall taking a group of master's students to Paraguay on a field study a few years ago, and we were fortunate to have an interview by the head of the World Bank at that time in his office in Central Asuncion. And in the course of the discussion, he just came out in the debate with my students from the University of Birmingham, the linkage with the political system. And he said, well, my understanding is, from what I've seen since the 5 years I've been here, virtually every member of the Senate, he said, virtually every member of the Senate is a large cattle rancher, either in their own name or through their wife's name or through what they call a testaferro, through a third-party name. So in the cattle ranching sector, if one tracks, for example, the surnames of members, the leadership of the Asociación Rural, its regional branches throughout the country, you see the same surnames as appeared in the 1920s, the 1940s, after the large land sales of Tierra Fiscal, the state land, going back nearly 100 years. Yes, in that sense, there is strong evidence of what you would call an oligopoly, defending the sort of interests of a small group. Where I would perhaps beg to differ is in the surge in soybean, the other element of the current growth model, cattle ranching, modern cattle ranching and soybean, where I didn't say this in the presentation, but the most accurate estimates suggest that over 90% of soybean production in Paraguay, which, by the way, in the last season, which just ended in March, was a new record. So soybean exports, despite COVID, are a new record on the world market. come from Brazilian immigrants and multinational or large companies that have got a strong Brazilian ownership, 90%. And because you're talking about somewhere in the region of 50,000 Brazilian commercial farmers, referred to as Brasiguajos in Paraguay, you can't really call that an oligopoly because it's a much larger number. However, that does raise issues about national sovereignty, which I alluded to, but I didn't go into in any detail right at the end of my presentation. I've recently given a paper about this at the University College London, a paper which I titled Paraguay and Brazil, a Protectorate in the Making. Paraguay, Brazil, un protectorado en construcción, which has been published in Brazil a few months ago and should be coming out soon in Paraguay. So yeah, to oligopoly, yes, on the cattle ranching sector, but on the soybean sector, I think that terminology is probably less appropriate.
Andrew, it seems to me that, much of what we're talking about are sort of hard geographic realities, and that there's not a lot of leeway here for interpreting things in different ways when we're talking about something as physically, manifest as the natural environment. But there's an interesting question that's come in from Saishon about South Korea that emphasizes maybe a different approach. It looks more at a cultural approach rather than a sort of, more factual environmental or physical approach. So I'll read Saishon's question. She says, South Korea and other countries in Asia have massively educated their people about economic development. South Korea implemented the new community service using literature to create a cultural shift within the Korean society that led to a disciplined, diligent, and productive society. Do you think that public policies in Paraguay have completely ignored the cultural aspects of development? Would you say that it is possible to adopt the same method? And if yes, then how to start?
Wow, thank you, Sishon, for that question. It's a tricky one. Public policy transfers in the field of cultural dynamics are notoriously complex and are also open to strong criticism on the grounds that they might be seen as divisive, particularly suggestions that come from countries in Europe might be seen as a kind of form of neo-imperialism. I would, however, say that I have great admiration both for transformations that have taken place in South Korean society in the past 50 years, absolutely dramatic improvement in living standards, and in particular, for example, the aid program that the South Korean government makes to Paraguay, which again is a very positive one. Without naming names, it's far more effective, far more inclusive and sustainable aid than that of many of the other donors that give assistance to Paraguay. Well, I see where you're going with this question. Cultural shifts in behavior are a very interesting one, and it would be interesting to see how that has happened in South Korea and whether there are elements in that strategy that could be employed in Paraguay. I think the verdict is out, the jury's out on that, and I will be interesting to see what could be done in that direction. But I think I'll just leave it at that.
There's, Andrew, a couple of questions here about Itaipu, and one of them from Carlos Antonio, and another one from an anonymous. And I thought it might make sense to put these together. Carlos asks, do you think there is any real chance to obtain a better deal with Brazil after 2023, given that the vast majority of Brazilians believe Itaipu is basically Brazilian, and that they are already doing Paraguay a favor as things are now, however absurd those views may be. And just a very quick related question here was about Jeffrey Sachs and his role in the renegotiation of Itaipu. And do you have any thoughts on Jeffrey Sachs and his capacity to make a difference?
Okay. Well, thank you, Carlos Antonio and Anonymous, for raising this question. There is no doubt that in the plethora of public policy reforms that I mentioned, the most important, by far the most important public policy decision that the government of Paraguay has to take in the coming period is the renegotiation with Brazil. Carlos Antonio, you're absolutely right in what you say, that in Brazil, not just amongst the political leadership, amongst the general population, unfortunately, there is this totally incorrect belief that Itaipu belongs to Brazil. And that is, in terms of the negotiation, that is a very worrying reality. I've written recently on this. Paraguay, we have to be realistic, is the junior partner in this respect. Brazil is a much larger country. It has got a range of levers at its disposal to pressure Paraguay on the renegotiation, levers like the Maquila sector, the presence of 300,000 Brasiguajos inside the country, the possibility of clamping down on the shopping tourism by establishing duty-free shops on the Brazilian side of the border, a clamp down on contraband by greater military use of military force. There are a whole range of levers at its disposal. So what can Paraguay do? Paraguay's main arm has to be moral justification for its position. And there, the threat to take this to the International Court of Justice at The Hague has to be its important card on the table. And at the same time, Paraguay needs to urgently carry out a national campaign such as Torricas did in Panama to raise awareness in secondary schools, in universities, so that the national understanding about the justice, the absolutely fundamental justice of the Paraguayan case is more widely known. Because unfortunately, again, outside intellectuals, more educated circles in Asunción, the understanding of the injustice of the Itaipu current treaty signed in 1973 is surprisingly limited. That's the sad fact. Now, what is worrying is we are now 2020, we're 3 years away at the most from the final date for negotiation. And I have to say, and this is a closing statement, is that I see little sign at the moment of moves in this direction. I see simply that the government, this present government, as in previous governments, is paying lip service to taking a stronger stance. And one worrying sign of this is that Carlos Antonio mentioned Jeffrey Sachs, but my understanding is, through my contacts that Jeffrey Sachs again appears to have been broadly a PR exercise. In other words, he is not actively involved at this moment in time, 21st of August 2020, in helping to structure a strong negotiating stance in the upcoming negotiations. This is the harsh reality. And it takes us back to the current model and the resistance to change, that there are sectors who are benefiting quite well from the current arrangement, will be quite pleased to see a renegotiation in which Brazil says, well, we'll build the exclusas, we'll build you the locks around the dam, which, by the way, were an obligation in the original treaty, which have never been done, as a kind of carrot to get Paraguay to accept a renegotiation which is not in the interests of the Paraguayan people as a whole. There's a real danger that could place. And of course, some Brazilian Paraguayan construction companies will be very pleased to go along with that because they would benefit from it. But in terms of the fundamental justice of the Paraguayan case, there's a danger that could be pushed to one side. At the moment, it's a rather worrying scenario because there is not a sign of the government taking this as seriously as it should be. There's probably never been a more important public policy decision in Paraguay for the past, perhaps joining Mercosur, for the past 30 years.
Andrew, I think everyone really appreciates your insights into these things. There are a couple more. I hope you're willing to, you said a closing statement there, but if we can push you, there are a couple more. I think this one will be of interest to you. This is from Arturo, quien nos manda saludos desde Nova Scotia. Thanks for being with us, Arturo, from so distant. And Arturo asks this, could you say a bit more about the role of the campesino movement in the development process, specifically their call for a genuine agrarian reform and the transformation of the present agro-extractive model into one based on cooperative, peasant-oriented alternatives that promotes food sovereignty and security? So maybe thinking about some examples from Concepcion that you'd mentioned. But how do you respond to that, Andrew?
Okay, well, this is something that I don't know an awful lot about, but I have some contacts inside the... I don't like to use the word peasant movement. Maybe it's because I'm English and peasant has a kind of pejorative, negative connotation as backward people. The people who are fighting for justice in rural areas are small farmers. They're small farmers. Small farmers who are suffering from this model, I think. Basically, there are two main groupings. The MCNOC, which is more of a loose association, and the FNC, the Federación Nacional Campesina, FNC. And they have been holding, I think going back now for maybe 20 years, maybe longer, an annual march in Asunción. And this is so revealing. You know, sociologists tell us that these visual manifestations are so revealing of what's happening in the real world. They have held a march, and in the early years, urban people would clap as they walk down the road, and they usually, supported by the Catholic Church, they stay at the at a large church building in the morning. They come from all over the country, march down, and the leadership have a meeting with the Minister of Agriculture, and some years with the President, and the promises are made. Promises are made to deal with the tierras malavidas, with the need for greater technical assistance, and a range of demands they make. And virtually always, nothing happens. And I'm not exaggerating. Very little happens. And the next year, it's usually in March or April, next year, another march takes place. These are groups that are wedded to non-violence. The marches never, in my experience, I don't think they've ever, over the past 20 or 25 years, resulted in violence with the police. And basically, because the resistance to change is so strong and so powerful, nothing happens. And that's the situation they're in. And yet they're doing very interesting work now. They are getting more and more involved in environmentally sustainable forms of agriculture. They are marketing their products through ferias in the capital city of Asunción. They are making links with urban NGOs of, you know, from middle-class student groups who are interested in environmental protection and so on. And these are very positive developments. But in terms of bringing about structural change, there is still this enormous blockage. And I don't, hand on heart, I don't see any greater flexibility of the current elite to take on board their demands. And of course, the crucial demands here, as I said in my presentation, is a radical reform of the Minister of Education. That is crucially important. And land reform dealing with the tierras malavidas, the scandal of the land that's been distributed to their detriment to very powerful people inside the country. So that's my take on the small farmer movement.
Thanks, Andrew. And it relates to a final question, and I think this will probably be the last one. It's actually, I'm going to sneak in sort of 2 in 1 here, because I want to make sure everyone who put questions up, at least everyone gets to say one thing, and this will cover that off. So there are 2 related questions here. I think we can take them together. One is from an anonymous viewer who asks this: what needs to happen politically in a theoretical sense is important, but how will this happen practically if, as you say, the government is plagued by corruption, clientelism, and little political will? How does the political will emerge? Or can it be encouraged to emerge? Maybe there's an international duty here. So that's one, and a very similar question from Violeta Carrillo. Thanks, Violeta, for your question here. She says, excellent presentation. Thank you, Andrew. From your perspective, where do you think the policy reforms may come from, considering that the economic political elite is the part of the political power that is supposed to do the reforms? So that's not an easy question. It's about, how can this happen in practice? And perhaps it relates to what you were saying about the, the small farmer movement, or, the reform of the agriculture ministry. What do you think, Andrew?
Gosh, these are very important questions, very good questions. Let me take the anonymous person's take on it. Yeah. Well, I don't think that this is, as you put it, the international duty to intervene. I think this is frankly quite dangerous. We've seen the adventures of the neocons around the world, maybe with the best of intentions of bringing democracy, bringing greater equality to countries around the world, and they've been totally and utterly counterproductive, and we're paying the price for that for generations. So this has to be domestically generated. And so then that takes me on to the points that Violeta is asking. Where is this change process going to come from? And here I think we've got to be realistic and recognize that large parts of rural, and I'm not being patronizing, please don't take me wrong, large parts of citizens of very low quality education have been historically easily manipulated by political leaders in their own communities, and who themselves pay service to people on the national arena. So improved quality education, civic education, is crucially important. But I'm sure Violeta is going to say, yes, that's fine, Mr. Nickson, but that's not going to bring change tomorrow. That's going to take a long time. So in the shorter term, moving in this direction, I think the historical experience of many countries suggests that the middle class, the urban middle class, play a very important role in this. They tend to be more educated, more self-confident, more vociferous, and we are seeing that now in Paraguay. We are seeing the emergence of social movements, urban social movements against corruption, people going out onto the streets, calling the leadership to account on various fronts. These are positive reforms. What we don't see yet in Paraguay is them linking up with the social activists in the rural areas, the leadership of the groups that I've referred to earlier in the small farmer movement. I think an alliance of this kind would be a very interesting development, but at the moment they are like on different rail lines. There are not very strong linkages between them. And again, we have to be realistic about this. This does not take place in a political vacuum. This takes through, as it should do in a democracy, it's filtered through political parties. At the moment, the two main political parties are of a very non-programmatic nature. I don't see any, and this is the most worrying thing. If one says, well, yes, if one looks at the youth sections of the Colorado Party, the youth sections of the Liberal Party. What is perhaps most depressing of all in the current scenario is that there is very little evidence of a modernizing, a different approach. They seem to be just like the same kind of people, only biologically younger in terms of their approach and what they want to get out of politics. So it has to be through the emergence, I think, of new political parties of a more programmatic kind. And on the left of the political spectrum, there is the party called Frente Iguaçu, which is certainly got a much greater programmatic content. On the right of the political spectrum, there was a party called Patria Querida, which had a programmatic content, but which seems to have dissolved and gone more towards support for an elitist position rather than a reformist position. So the scenario is still very weak in this respect, but I think that this link up between the social movements that are emerging in urban areas, and interestingly, just to finalize, what hasn't received a lot of media coverage recently is that small social movements now emerging in many municipalities around the country, not just in Encarnacion and Concepcion, but there are at least 30 quite small municipalities where people have come out onto the streets in the past 6 months, and not just about COVID, but about corruption inside their own municipal administrations. And that, I think, again, is very positive, because in the past there was this assumption that it's only in the big cities that people, that you had a kind of a social movement likely to appear. But you're now seeing them appear in places where there were never, ever social protests on the street. And I think that again is very positive. But it needs some kind of mechanism, some kind of national association to bring these groups together to strengthen each other in a common endeavor with a broad program, consensus program of demands. And perhaps it's something like Itaipu, the renegotiation of Itaipu, that could gel this, could bring them together.
Well, Andrew, thanks. I'm sort of assuming you must be quite exhausted. I know that if it were me, I wouldn't be able to say much more. We've actually reached our time here as well. In fact, we've gone a bit over, and you know, there are several people who attended the event who asked multiple questions, but I think we're going to give Andrew a break here. And everyone who has asked a question, at least each person you've responded very well to. And so, look, I really just want to thank you and thank Mechi and Alejandra for bringing us together here to talk about these issues, which, as I said before, really are relevant to not just Paraguay, but to Latin America more broadly. And I would say as well, other agricultural countries such as Australia. In fact, this topic is a good point of convergence, or a bridge, I think, between us, something that we can help each other to understand and hopefully to manage a little better than we currently are. And also to share our successes, right? It's not all problems, there are some positives here. And so, you know, hopefully that's something that we can encourage you, researchers, students, to get in touch with us and continue your studies and look at these issues. So look, Mechi, Alejandra, I'll pass over to you and just say thanks again for bringing us together for talking to talk about this.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Andrew. This was an engaging debate. Thank you very much to the audience for the questions. I would like to remind everybody that you can rewatch this session on the YouTube channel and on the PSA Facebook page. It was a great session today, so we look forward to speaking to you again tomorrow in the final session of Paraguay Speaks Australia 2020, Day 5, the Strategic Alliance for Belmont Reds Paraguay, Australia. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night, your morning, and this is the end of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew, for your insightful presentation, and thank you, Adrian, for being the host and moderator of tonight. You brought such a level to this conference, and you showed all the sides of Paraguay. So we want to let you know that while this conference was happening, we had amazing feedback from the audience. So thank you very much for the engaging debate that you created in this academic space of the Paraguayan Student Association.
Just one more thing to add. I think that as academics, we have the commitment to show both sides. So after having a great presentation from the government, we also talk about indigenous people, and now we have all these critical insights. So hopefully we'll continue to improve our development.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for inviting me. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Alejandra.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mercedes.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.